they claim as a motive of their retaliations to David, assuming the position of his extraordinary profits would materialize early before their insurrectionist war would have, if released for the mission in Hawaii, not been obstructed in key overlapping interests as a part of the same network of the security branch, such as David's cryptocurrency mining, which he would have done without their sabotage, which was targeted for the purposes of stopping this estimate. This would have materialized the full restoration of that, which would have had David released according to all of his estimated values, including the release of his education contracts, which would have facilitated his knowledge on how to do all of the things that they already knew was legally his right to have, that they do not have a right to obstruct. And therefore, the construction of a garden around the Roseburg house would have actively had cycled all of the rainwater, including the position of the crypto mining, which he would have had in the den and underneath the house, which he would have completely fixed up, including fixing all of the pipes and the floor underneath the house, which would be on stilts, which would be replaced and fully maintained, including fixing the toilets and the rest of the house. At which point, these things that were important to fix would have been repaired, or he would have ignored them if they were otherwise unimportant, like the back porch, in which case that was somebody else's responsibility. At which points the function of the restoration against the damages, which includes the storing up of all of the water in the front of the house, required him to fix the porch, including the water pump, which would have had all of the excess rainwater drain into it, as all of the gutters in the roof would redirect all of the rainwater into that gutter to cycle throughout the garden and underneath the house for the computer mechanisms and the crypto mining, which would have been important for the Hawaii mission, which would have allowed him to move all of the cryptocurrencies into the Lahaina bank. He would have to start for them releasing him to do the mission, would release all of his accounts so that he would construct the material things so that he could do the bank and all of the support structure and all of the support insurance services essential to protect against the threat of the fire. This then would allow him to deposit all the cryptocurrencies and hire outside insurance uh, contractors to engage in the full coverage of each of the materials, including the 100,000 per crypto coin that would have been mined and deposited in the location, at which point David would make NFTs of the cryptocurrencies, which then would allow him to trade them inside his game, which would be reconstructed in the Lahaina Bank for its network. The mainframe being at that location in the most insured location allows for the most viable use of resources, at which point the release of David to do the mission would have completely fixed those things, including any of the necessary maintenances, as the heating cooling systems from the Linwood house would have been repaired. This would have also released him to do the Revenge X's War on David channels properly, as they releasing him to do the mission would release the purchases of the channel so that the original reporters who had a simulation that they would have been in a romantic relationship with him and would have broken up and were contracted to retaliate in the Terror Factory under James Comey's communism would have facilitated the actual reporting, as David would have hired journalists in order to create the primary collection of the data so that they could do those reportings, which is still separate to David's national news doing his reporting, and therefore is not something that he is liable for, as he would merely be facilitating the service on the platform, which, being reconstructed under the release from the mission, is funded by David being able to travel around and acquire all of the additional fundings from all of his travel works. This, of course, would have had to have released him to do the Canada mission to restore the Canada trucking nonprofit, and then it possibly may have something to do with the Australia mission, which is still classified, in order for the rest of this to be done, at which points that may or may not overlap, as the function of support structures essential for the releasing him to do the mission, which is not the releasing of his title, which would have allowed him to actually pursue the remedy, which they were concerned against, at which point their decision to renege on this was a subordination to do the human sacrifice for the fire in Lahaina as a subordinate function of their occult worship, and this, of course, having to release David to do his sexual relationships in order to restore his sexual market value, which would have negated the Antichrist ritual of converting David Bowles into the Antichrist, as their restraints against his title has all of the obstructed values, which allows him to be hidden until he's released all at once, like the Antichrist is supposed to do, but the restoration of his sexual market value and other key things would violate the qualifications of the Antichrist, who does not have sexual relations with women. This, of course, would have also restored David's additional mansions and safe houses in other locations where he would have sent many of the other women who would not be allowed to engage in the romantic relationships for various reasons, as many of them would have otherwise, but were not a part of that agreement for the purposes of the necessary resources to do the mission, at which point he would have been replaced with their chosen model, which they have several characters for, at which point this would have fully restored him to do that, at which point the successes in the trades, funded with the additional resources, such as David's obstructed titles, medals, which all have stipends, and therefore the payments for all of the benefits being obstructed, held in secret accounts that are currently being frozen, would have actively funded the restoration of many of the other essential faculties in order to do the support network essential for the mission, at which point the data collection network would have been stabilized, allowing him to trade at full capacity with the full restoration of his mind and body, including his sexual health, which is his brain health, including his diet, including his sleep, including his exercise, and the rest of this would have facilitated his active travels, as he would have constructed the Lahaina location and hired out all of the locals systematically for all of the services needed, including the capping of the rest of the population with the art companies, such as for movies, TVs, and so forth, providing the insurance locations and protections, which would have been contracted with other companies in order to protect in collaboration, at which point some of the other nonprofits would have made contracts with the surveillance agents in order to make the contact with David, which would have forced them to have the various benefits, such as releasing David's foundation to engage in trades with them concerning the normalization, security, and protections of the systems, which would have been actively a part of the Lahaina mission. This then would have allowed David to have actively made money, sustaining the collaborative works with these movies and TV shows, etc., which would have actively had him maintaining many of the in-person relationships with the talent, which was the big trigger or flashy indicator or positive value rendered from the concept of the charity. And of course, the profits of this would have been for the various charity purposes and on both ends, both for them and for David's charity systems, in which case the rendered additional values from these collaborations from David's profits would have re-engaged in the function of the network interest from the zombie insurance from the released mission, refunneling all of the resources into the purpose for the mission, which would have provided all of the necessary preparations to stop against the fire, including the collection of the ocean waters, as automated sprinklers would react to temperature. This, of course, would actively reduce the viability of fires that were derived by his absence. That they understood David to be essential in order to stop, at which point the function was them engaging in human sacrifice of those peoples in a plotted murder from the sale of the right of conquest by the Confederate white supremacist communist insurrectionists who have engaged in these systematic retaliations, who have sold the right of conquest of the United States as systematic treason, as they are and have always been an enemy combatant to the United States, as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government, or otherwise a hostile intelligence non-state actor, which includes the double agents in the military and intelligence communities, which take government equipment and leave it for privatized uses in order to do the Confederate mission in subversion of national security, in order to accomplish missions that were illegal for the government to do and illegal for civilians to do, which would clearly pollute all of the data collections, nullifying any legal cases that they would have, which would force it to be thrown out, as it would be an illusion scamming the record, and the fraud against the record removes the justification of the use of the government to its official functions, which have to follow the procedures which would have nullified or discarded them, as they have to be thrown out of court, proving they do not viably have an argument to any of their blah 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 bullshit, whichever scam they're trying to peddle. And again, the retaliations in order to get David fired for accomplishing all of his legitimate missions, covert or otherwise, would have actively been illegal firing or retaliations for that illegal firing, which would force David to receive an expert lawyer in that field in order for the purposes of distributions of the legal reactions, in order to engage in the defenses against these criminal subversions as a retaliation and their enforcement of a threat against national security and of America's allies. Now, with the restoration of David's education from their obstructed estimates from the School of Hard Knocks, he would have actively had the full clearance on all of the other activities, at which point he would have been using the food from the garden in order to cook for the help, both for those who are donating or volunteering or becoming employed or whatnot, automating each of these services at each of the locations, at which point the full security, including the maintenance of the self-sustained aquifers, which according to aquaponics actively has a self-cleaning mechanism such as plants and fish and the rest of that, according to the cycling water system. This, of course, would actively allow for all of the necessary resources to do the cooking with, which David's skills would have been more than adequate for them to engage in this function, at which point the essentials having been fully taken care of as a normal benefit of those charity services would have already been acknowledged as their essential part of the market according to their agreed registered purposes, at which point all of the benefits would have actively sustained an outrageous success, which was the thing being retaliated against. Again, their objective is selling the right of conquest, and therefore a successful mission for the United States is a failure of the verification that they've sold it to be destabilized and destroyed, according to the Communist War Strategy from the protocols I learned out of Zion, which includes struggling sessions, demoralization, and general public disconnection and dysfunction, which is derived by those insurgents for white supremacy. These betrayals of the United States are not limited to that mission. There are many other classified and other types of missions which should be fully expressed and published, at which point these severe retaliations for successes must not stand and must be fully compensated and restored. The obstructed value. As the victims of the fire of Lahaina had actively been leaving, some have suggested reports that those who have left had been arrested for their leaving the danger zone, which is proof positive of the ritual sacrifice for their satanic occult rituals and the reinforcing of their refusal to violate the Antichrist ritual in their abuses against David Bowles, which is proof positive of their core identity and loyalty in service of their white supremacist communism, promoted by their deals with the devil and therefore their Faustian prophets. Now, the undermining of David's School of Hard Knocks education contracts undermines the zombie insurance contracts and all other insurance protections, such as the network interests, the algorithms, and the obstruction of the general faculties, which are essential for a sober, educated answer, which obstructs any legal responses essential to the government, such as court or speaking with Congress and so forth, as an act of malicious censorship as a retaliation for the prospect that the United States security would succeed against their plot of the right of conquest sale, such as, but is not limited to, their purchase of access to the CCP and having taken payoffs by quote unquote donations, otherwise known as bribes, which then would lead for the sale of essential military equipment and technologies expensively gained and cheaply distributed, as the sale of those products to the insurgents inside of the government sold the technologies which without would have allowed the supremacy of the United States to have been sustained, and as they've sold the right of conquest, would have had to have provided to them. Otherwise, the ability to have successfully engaged in that invasion would be nullified, and therefore the only way to sell the right of conquest is to actually give them the ability to feasibly acquire the conquest. And with the release to do the missions, all of the other services, such as the automation and whatnot, would have been successful and not been a scam, as the release of the contract requires them to actually follow through on all of those values, allowing for the systematic construction of that, which then is then deposited into the nonprofits, automating the cycling resources in order to accomplish the network interest in its restoration. And again, these are motives to their terrorist operations and in violation of constitutional law and David's rights and the others' rights to have received these benefits being illegally targeted as criminal retaliations for their attempt to censor him in their illegal firing of David from the classified hired position, which they are trying to fire and retaliate against him with the censorship in order to acquire the objectives in dismantling the essential securities to the United States. And again, the releasing for the mission would require them to release his secret accounts specifically connected to the missions, such as the payments for the metals and other benefits that they had estimated he would have won otherwise, which provides active secret accounts which would have actively been paid into and been storing for those positions, at which point the restoration of the brokerage would have allowed those resources to have been invested in order to engage in the full restoration of all of the other essentials, which credited David according to their terrorist warrant in order to accomplish the mission of selling the right of conquest of American jurisdictions to adversaries, foreign and domestic, presumes the $100,000 turned into $4 million in average every single week, every single year. At which point, the function of those profits from those investments, from the restoration and stabilization of the faculties, proving the viability of his talents as a trader, is certified by them in the warrants of retaliation. First and foremost, relying on the profits from the metals in their own accounting, at which point there is enough time to spend all of the necessary resources before waiting for it to collect to its potential capped viability, at which point, let's take, for instance, a week's worth of trading might take 6 months. He needs to be able to collect on the money for the next series of trades, and he can't do that as long as he's waiting on the investment to happen, at which point all of the additional stored resources from those accounts, which have all of the excess money, allows him to make these consecutive long-term trades in order to materialize the full viability of their potential, at which point they would be reaching maturity before, at which point they are fully successful in their own time and do not require him to actively undermine the possibility of one trade in order to engage in another. Again, derived by his ability to find the information from the obstructed faculties which would have been restored, essential for the specific techniques in order for his fully functioning mind to engage in the perfectly executed strategies believed by the adversary. At which point, those who would need to pay, such as the highly expensive talent, such as the Hollywood actors and so forth, would each be paid their portions according to their ability to have taken from those investments, at which point he would have convinced them of what the trade was, and he would tell them that the end product of that would be theirs if they buy the contract, automating their execution on it. So they then would have their fiduciary execute the remainder of the thing as the starting price for their work, at which point their talent and their wages have already been paid for, satisfied by these missions, which then gives them the additional benefits as they have purchased the right from that, facilitating uh, adjusted prices which are in their favor. Now, this also includes their other obligations to receive benefits, such as the first-class flights, which would be mostly derived by David's released function with his credit cards, such as his spending it for the cost of businesses, such as with the trucking, such as the gas and fuel, and all of the things he needs to do with that, as the gas is gas and the fuel is like food and the rest of that stuff, being able to sustain the truckers, making sure all of the sustained positions, all of the repair shops, all of the upgrades, all of the additional luxuries that would be doing, as the functional truckers would be upgrading their trucks into basically luxurious campers as a benefit of their cooperation with the thing, at which point these all have their own specific costs, which I don't have the specific numbers for. To this end, those various exchange trades would have materialized people's ability to have done that, not just with the high-grade talent, but with large corporate activities and subgroups making deals as unions or their own little sub-companies, etc., at which point all of those trades exponentially divide into those profits, taking care of those needs as the accounts deplete, which would then be replenished by the successful profits from the workers having taken those deals, generating profitable contracts, which refills everything effectively and quickly relative to whatever the specific service is. So if you're wondering how he was going to pay for the supermodels and highly attractive women that he would have been protecting, otherwise sending them off into various locations to be taken care of on the traveling system, according to the secure mansions and whatnot, it's paid for by the previous owners buying those contracts, which then gives access to the properties, which then allows those people to be deposited into those locations, providing the full competent security. This, of course, facilitates the viable possibilities of all of the additional people that would be able to be taken in, such as in the case of the fire, where they would be outside of their houses, they would be able to be redeposited into the excess rooms from those locations, which would have been paid for by those contracts, securing them in the entirety until the full obligations to them have been satisfied to the fullest extent of the contract agreement. Now, theoretically, they could go back into many of the other obstructed trade histories, which would have been going on for an exponential amount of time, as far back as they want to in the Legend of David, which would have stretched even before his birth or even the birth of his dad, at which point the entire thing is mostly classified. Take, for instance, the concept of their need for David to become dedicated to national security, which is the reason they would have been approaching him to do the Lahaina mission in the first place, is that in order for the insurgents to be able to get into Congress and the others, they would have had to have controlled the aristocracy, which they estimated David to be the leader of, arresting him as the patriarchy. To this extent, the trade contract schedule, which would have asserted that wealth that they have estimated puts him in the aristocracy, which has direct authority in the creation of the Senate, which then also, as a D.C. power broker, exponentially turns him into the primary power broker as the patriarchy, which is why they were arresting him for their communist overthrow of the United States, when they received payments from the Soviet Union and other foreign adversaries in order to accelerate their wealth, status, and competencies, which is payment for acts of treason, which their programs have been using, including the misuse of classifications, surveillance, subversions, fake experiments as terrorist retaliations, forming a neo-KKK in order to enforce the communist ambitions, softening up and demoralizing the general public in preparations for the right of sale conquest and the contract of the right of sale, the right of conquest in the contract to the CCP and others would have actively been conveyed through these mechanisms supported by the insurgent terrorists. We've compromised those offices, dismantling the purpose of the United States military and intelligence apparatus, which has been fully compromised in service of the USSR's war against the United States, as well as other sales, as they, as a parasite, systematically destroy American interests and collapse it as their malicious contempt towards the average American civilian is their key guiding light. This, of course, attaches the contract schedule, which includes the 6 layers, each layer being worth $800 billion in the 90s, which they would have had to have sold at an accelerated rate in order to get David to do the national security apparatus, in order for him to have not just ignored them and done the long version, inevitably becoming the top of the aristocracy, choosing or leading the primary choices concerning the election systems, which includes his national news corporations, which would have actively influenced substantive changes to the outcome of the elections, at which point they, knowing this, targeted them for those substantive changes, enforcing their communist voter fraud. Now, this assumes the position of the trades, which they did not want to pay for directly, and therefore they would have taken a loan out from the 2 black bankers' banks contracted with David in the network, according to this estimate, at the 25% interest a year, which then divides down to the lower ranks in the entire Confederate operations and the saturation of their agenda as necessary force in order to win, including Suckler's insurrection for the white trash inbred fucknuggets who thought that the stupidest thing in the world was in fact not treason, although they were quite proud of the rebellion, at which points the contradiction is self-understood, and the fact that they know that they are a hated enemy of the United States as they hate it more materializes as obvious structures in their terrorist plots against the United States, including the judicial activist insurgents for the Communist Party, which has actively been lying for the Communist Party, covering up for the mission to destroy the United States by the frauds which they are personally aware of, and co-signing as they lie for the Communist Party in bad faith and subversion of their office and the existence of society, which they, again, hate with every aspect of their being. They self-identify exclusively as a public enemy. To this extent, those mechanisms of those white supremacist communists would have actively divided the liability of those costs in the pyramid scheme that is their entire economic theory, which then materializes the structure of their pyramid scheme, which then divides the liabilities, mostly being at the bottom as it goes up to the pinnacle, at which point they would have promoted people like Donald Trump in order to be the top, at which point other people that they were promising accelerations, requiring them to lie for the Communist Party, like many of the characters like Peter Thiel, William Barr, Elon Musk, and so on, may or may not actually be the people themselves. They might just be characters. It's non-verified, but it's important to state who they claim to be in order to accelerate the white supremacist communism's central planned outcome for those who would have willingly compromised themselves in order to acquire the deal with the devil's promotion and status and wealth from the centrally planned outcome, having engaged in the terrorism, subverting all competition, guaranteeing their substantive returns, at which point they, being at the liability bottom, are given the acceleration from those contracts, which then materializes their potential from their willingness to make themselves vulnerable to the Communist Party, which then allows their exponential ascension. According to the Communist agenda and its overall interests, everyone involved in the thing is given a lottery-type situation where they claim that they would have access to the potential of the winnings of the lottery, but only some of them will win the lottery, at which point Plato's conspiracy works perfectly and viably with them as a core aspect of their trailer trash community. At which point, the purchase of those things through those loans and the entanglement of those liabilities require them to keep up in the contract schedules purchases of the necessary services for that system, which then makes those products viable. At which point, they're not just meeting the quotas provided by the selling of the contracts, which presumes a certain amount of profits, but they are also making all of the additional value as they are personally liable to the attachment of that product, at which point they guarantee the sales essential to that structure according to their agenda, at which point their fundamental core identities are intertwined with the successes of those businesses, which they rely on the purchase and distribution of those legal profits and products intimately. And this being fundamentally infused with the banks actively divvy out to the other investment types of blah, 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 specifics, blah, 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 BCS, blah, 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 algorithms, blah, 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 money, actively amplifying the filtration systems of all of the other possible viable trades, such as the zombie insurance, which would have been fundamental to the successes of the Soviet Union, as David Bowles was the peace child taking the trades money in order to give the saturation of the insurance coverage to the USSR and its inevitable collapse, and the structure of the zombie insurance triggering on that would assist them in their problems, at which point the breaking down of their society, which was fundamentally inevitable based upon decades of bad policy, materializes in the culmination of those investments receiving these boosts in collaboration with each other, which then materializes the function of David's influence with the Russian Federation, which was going to replace the USSR, which would then allow him to solve the problems with them and the Ukrainians, which then makes David the only reason the war in Ukraine wouldn't happen, at which point they had to get rid of him in order for the war in Ukraine, which they had agreed when the USSR made the plot with the white trash in the United States to do the demoralizing process in order to collapse the government. At which point David would systematically have many of these influences and leverages and promotions, sustaining his capability of stopping the foundation of that threat, at which point Ukraine, having separated in the collapse of the USSR, would have been properly managed, and the threat against the Russian Federation wouldn't have formed. At which point the international community rebalancing would not have those problems, and we would actively have the peace. At which point the issue could easily be solved, similar to the function of the Palestinians in the conflict with the Israelis, as the function of David from those exchanges would have had administrative attendance, which then would have materialized a constitutional kingdom in their theory independent to David's actions, with the intention from the signals of those trades in order to provide the services in order to sell to David, is their claim concerning this arrangement, which then has the consulate taking over the Palestinian areas, which then become David's, at which point the population being David's possession according to that kingdom is fundamentally the theory of the retaliation, meaning the genocide in Gaza is exclusively the fault of David's absence, and therefore those who contributed to these low-status distractionary nonsenses running the interference are exclusively and personally responsible for their slaughter, as an active decision from the core of their being. Other such problems, such as the historic crimes against the black community, would have also been solved. The crash of '08 would have been solved. 9/11 would have been solved. The crash of '87 was estimated to have been solved, and many other secrets which otherwise would wouldn't have been able to have disturbed the people, which were fundamentally intertwined with the viability of the public consciousness, and its security needed David as well. At which point, the subversion of all of this is fundamental to the idea of these aggressors, and their hatred for David is that he blocks their way to their ambitions against the United States and the human race they hate so dearly. As if you were not a mass murdering psychopath, the degenerate white trash communists were never going to fulfill their promises to you. They are, as their master, deceit.